Come up the ice road into Stillmark in the long hush if you must, and I will feed you and warm you and give you my own bed. But do not thank me aloud. Do not cough without smothering it. Do not call to your dog. And if you fall on the last stair and break your leg, bite through your sleeve and let go of the noise, because we will find you anyway. We always find people. And if you scream, we will bury you politely and never speak of you again. That was the law of my kingdom for 3 generations. I enforced it for 11 years. I was very good at it. My father's father laid the hush down after the ice came the first time, and my father kept it, and I kept it, and if you had asked me why, I would have looked up. That is all any of us ever did. We looked up. Above the roofs of Stillmark, hung along the whole northern lip of the valley like a lid half lifted off a pot, sits an ice field a mile broad and 300 feet deep at its throat. We call it the Weight. It has never had another name. In the years it is thickest, the light comes down into the hold through it, blue and slow, and the children grow up believing the sky is made of stone and mercy. We built downward away from it. Stillmark is a roofed hold, half sunk, turfed over, with its lanes cut below the snowline and its halls timbered and dark and warm. Strangers say it is like living inside a chest of drawers. They say it in a whisper, because by then we have taught them. We do not shout. We do not sing. We do not ring, strike, hammer, or clap. Wolfkin though we are, we do not shift, because the shift is not quiet. Bone moves against bone with a wet crack that carries, and no living person in my hold has worn their other shape. I have never worn mine. I am the alpha king of a people who have forgotten what they look like. And we do not, above all, keep the sounders in the rolls. I will get to that. Let me first tell you about my nephew, because he is the whole of it. Ilson was 5 that winter, and had never made a sound. Not a cry when he was born. The midwife told me she thought him dead and had already begun the sign for it. Not a laugh, though he laughed constantly, shoulders going, mouth wide open, silent as snowfall. Not a word. He was not deaf. He could hear a snow mouse under the floor. He simply did not use his throat the way you and I do not use our ears to lift things. He signed. He signed beautifully, faster than his tutors, faster than me, hands like 2 small birds fighting. He was my brother's son. My brother Corin has been dead 9 years, and I still catch myself putting food on his plate. The 9th of grieving, in Ilson's 5th winter, he went up onto the ice. I have gone back over that morning so many times that I have worn the truth off it, the way a step wears. What I have left is this. The boy was in the mews with the birds. Then the boy was not in the mews. Then Hor came down the gallery stair at a run. Hor was 19 years old and gray to the lips, and he was the finest thing my father ever gave me. Understand, please, that our wolves in Stillmark are not omens, and they are not pets, and they do not bow to anybody. They are the hold's throat. A wolf's chest rumble is a low sound, so low it moves through packed snow the way a hand moves through water. And this is the thing the Weight taught us at terrible cost. The ice does not hear low sound. It hears sharp. It hears struck. So we breed for chest and we train for relay, and a message goes from the west gate to the high pasture in the time it takes me to lace a boot. A rumble, a pause, a rumble. 3 long is fire. 2 short is a birth. 1 long held until it hurts is a child gone. Hor came down the stair with 1 long held until it hurt. You have never seen a search like a search in the hush. 200 people out of their doors in 11 minutes, and not 1 word spoken. Torches went up the terraces in a line, silent as a rope being drawn. Sib, Hor's granddaughter, took the wolves out along the east rim in a fan. My steward stood in the middle of the lane weeping and signing at me, and I could not make out a single letter of it because his hands were shaking. I went up the Sounders Road. Nobody goes up the Sounders Road. That is not a rule. It is only a fact, the way nobody goes into the sea. It is a cut stair, and then it is not a stair, and then it is a broken line of iron pegs some dead woman drove into the rock 90 years ago, and then it is the ice itself. It took me an hour. Halfway up above the last of the torches, above the roofline and the turf and the smoke, the world simply stops being loud, and you understand that the whole silence is not silence at all. It has been full of breath and boots and cloth this whole time. Up there is the real thing. The weight does not creak. It does not sigh. Poets have got that wrong for a century. It sits. I came over the last shelf on my hands and knees, and I heard a woman singing. I want to be exact about what happened in me, because I have lied about it since in small ways to make myself better than I was. First, horror. Simple, whole, physical horror, the kind that empties your hands. Somebody was making noise on top of the weight. I have been trained since I could walk to feel that as I would feel a knife going into my mother. Second, the ringing stopped. 9 years earlier, the ice had come down on the funeral of my father and killed my brother Corin and my brother's wife Ada and 41 other people, and buried the whole West Terrace and left me, 17 years old, dug out at midnight with my ears full of blood, with a high thin whine in my skull that never afterward went away. Not for 1 hour. Not in sleep. Physicians called it the bell note. I called it nothing at all because you do not name what you have to carry. I had lived 9 years inside a sound so constant that I had stopped believing in quiet, and I sat on the lip of the weight with my palms in the snow, and a woman I could not see was humming somewhere ahead in the dark, and my head was empty and cool and still. I made a noise then myself. I would like it recorded that the first man in 3 generations to break the hush on the ice was the king, and that he did it by making an animal sound out of relief. She had my nephew inside her coat. She was on one knee with her back to me, a sounding pole across her thighs, and Ilson was buttoned in against her chest with only the top of his head out, and she was humming with her chin on his crown, and she did not stop when I came up. She did not stop when I got to my feet. She turned her head, saw the crown on me. I had gone up in my hunting clothes, but you cannot take a crown off a face, and she went on humming, and she signed with one hand, low and unhurried. He is cold and he is fine. Don't run at me. He's asleep. I signed, be silent. And she looked at me the way you look at a man who has said something ridiculous in a language. He is only pretending to speak, and kept humming, and rocked my brother's son on the top of the mountain that killed my brother. Her name was Marin. It was on none of our rolls. She was 26 years old and had been dead for 7 of them. Here is our shame. Somebody must go up. The weight moves, every ice field moves, and it must be tested at the 4 turns of the year, the grain read, the throat measured, and the only way to do it is for a person to climb up there with an iron-shod pole and lean out over the calving edge. Long ago we asked for volunteers and got none, so we made a bargain and dressed it as an honor. A sounder is given her funeral on the day she takes the office. Her name is struck from the rolls of the living. Her seat is taken away from her table. Her family mourns her properly with the full right and eats the meal, and afterward she is fed at the kitchen door like a beggar and lives in the low sheds by the pegs. She cannot marry. She cannot testify. She cannot be robbed, since a dead woman owns nothing, and she cannot be murdered, since you cannot kill the dead, a thing that will matter later, and that I would give a great deal to unknow. We told ourselves it was mercy. We told ourselves that if she is already mourned, then the day the ice takes her, nobody has to grieve twice. What it actually was, we could not bear to send a living woman up there, so we killed her first on paper where it cost us nothing. I had signed 19 such funerals with my own hand. I had eaten 19 of those meals. I brought Ilson down the Sounders Road at 3 in the morning with Marin walking ahead of me, and I was so full of fear and gratitude and the strangeness of an empty head that when we reached the pegs, and Warden Otho Greel came up the last stair with his lantern and his ledger satchel and his 4 hushmen, and made the sign for she made noise on the ice, I stood there and let him. I let him, that is the sentence. There is no better way to write it. They took her by both arms. She let them. She was not frightened. She was already dead, and there is nothing you can do to a dead woman that has not been done. But she turned her head as they walked her down, and she looked at the boy in my arms, and Ilson, who had never in his life reached for anything, who accepted the world the way a stone accepts weather, took his hand out of my collar and reached after her, and his face came apart, and no sound came out of it at all. He wept without a noise, just water and his mouth open, and the tendons standing in his neck as if he were pulling on a rope. I had that boy for 5 years, and I never once heard him grieve. That night I saw it, and I want you to understand what it looks like, because I did not until then, and I had built my whole kingdom on it. It looks like a child being strangled slowly by nothing. Warden Greel fined her for the humming. It was the standard fine, 3 months' fuel, doubled on the ice. She had no fuel and no money because she owned nothing, so the fine went to the hold's debt, and the hold's debt on a dead woman is worked off in seasons. He also opened a proceeding, and this is where I ask you to sit forward. Greel was not cruel. I have wanted him to have been cruel for years now, and he refuses. He was a small, dry, meticulous man of 50 who genuinely believed that the hush was the only reason his grandchildren were alive, and he had spent his life on it, and the tongue fines paid his office and his hushmen and the beeswax for the ledgers. And if you had told him he had built a business out of terror, he would have wept, and then gone back to the ledgers. There are more men like Greel than there are villains. That is the whole difficulty. His proceeding said this. The sounder Marin had committed sustained voluntary sound on the weight itself, in the hush, with the king present. That is the gravest thing in our law, but the law can only hang the living. Therefore the warden petitioned to restore her to the rolls of Stillmark, to make her alive formally, with a right and a name and a seat, so that she could be tried and put to death. I have read that petition perhaps 100 times. It is written in a lovely clear hand. It is 9 lines long. It contains the sentence the restoration is to be understood as a courtesy and shall be reversed upon execution. And I did not throw it in the fire. Do you know what I did? I set it aside for the midwinter court, because I did not have time to think about it, because I was busy planning a ceremony. The boy stopped eating. That is the small, brutal thing that turned me, and I am not proud that it took a child's appetite and not a woman's life. Ilson sat with his hands in his lap for 2 days and would not touch bread. He would not sign. On the 3rd morning I found him gone from his bed again, and my heart stopped in my chest like a horse refusing a gate. And Hor found him in 9 minutes, curled asleep against the door of the sounder's shed, on the snow, at the feet of a dead woman who had come out and put her own coat over him, and then sat down beside him, because she was forbidden to bring him in. She stood up when she saw me. She did not bow, the dead don't. I signed, "Why does he come to you?" She thought about it honestly. I remember that. Most people answer a king before they have finished hearing him. "Because I'm loud," she signed. Then she said it out loud, in a voice like a hand laid flat on a table, low, unhurried, a hoarse woman's voice with the ice in it. And she said it inside the hold, 4 feet from the king, with the weight over both our heads. "Because I'm loud." Every hair on my body stood up, and the ringing stopped, and my skull filled with cold, clean nothing, and I did not have her taken, and that is the moment my reign turned, and it turned on cowardice. I did not stop her because I wanted her to keep talking. I said in a whisper like a criminal, "Where did you learn to speak?" "Up there." She tipped her chin at the ceiling, at the turf and the snow and the mile of ice above it. 7 years. Nobody up there to hear me. First year I couldn't. Throat's a muscle, my lord. It goes. "And you sing." "I sing because it's 4 hours to the throat and back and I get bored," she said. "And because when you're on the calving edge with your pole out over nothing, and you're alone, and you're already buried, and nobody has said your name since you were 19 years old," she stopped, and rolled her shoulder, and looked down at my nephew asleep at her feet. "It is a great pleasure to make a noise and have the mountain not care." I said, "The mountain cares." And she said, "No, my lord, it doesn't." I want to tell you I demanded proof. I did not. I turned around and walked back into my hold, and lay awake until the ringing came back at dawn, and understood that I had just been told the largest thing anyone would ever tell me and had chosen not to hear it, because I had a midwinter ceremony to hold, in which my brother's son would be named my heir, and at which, by my own decree, sealed the previous spring, because it was fitting, because it was traditional, because it had been done for my father and his, the great bell of Stillmark would be rung. We have one bell. We have exactly one, because a bell is a sacrilege in a silent country, and we keep it in a stone housing on the west terrace, and it is rung on the day a king is crowned, and on the day a king is buried, and never otherwise in a century. It is a ton of bronze, black-green, older than the hold, and it is not called the voice or the herald or any grand thing. It is called the grieve. It was rung at dawn on the day of my father's funeral, 9 years ago. The ice came down 4 hours later, and every soul in Stillmark knows, as they know their own hands, that the weight fell because a woman screamed. She was a laundress named Annette, and she was on the west terrace with the mourners, and her child had wandered toward the terrace edge, and she screamed the child's name. They put it in the record that afternoon while men were still digging. 43 dead and 1 screaming woman, and the arithmetic was so easy that nobody ever did it again. She was not hanged, because we are not barbarians. She was put out of the hold onto the ice road in grieving, with her hands untied, which is our way of not being barbarians. She lasted, they think, 2 days. The child she screamed for was 7 years old and was made a ward of the kitchens, and was given the offer at 19, as the daughters of the disgraced always are, and took it, because it was that or the kitchen door for life. Marin never told me. I want that on the record too. She had 2 months in which to say your hold murdered my mother for a noise, and she never said it, not to me, not to the boy, not once. I found it myself on the 4th night of grieving, in a ledger of the dead in my own archive, because Greel's petition to restore her had required her lineage in a clean hand, and Greel is meticulous, and there it was. Marin of Annette struck, sounder no seat. I sat down on the archive floor. I was 34 years old and the king of Stillmark, and I sat down on the floor like a man whose legs have been taken out from under him with a pole. She was in the sheds. I went down in the middle of the night with a lantern and no guard, and she opened the door, and she saw my face, and she said before I could speak, because she had known for weeks that I would come to this eventually, and she had been waiting the way you wait for weather. You want to know if it was her. Yes. It wasn't. How do you know? And Marin, who had been buried at 19, put on her coat and picked up her pole and said, "Come up and I'll show you. Bring your hammer." Nobody had gone up the Sounders Road with a sounder in the history of my kingdom. That is the office. It is a solitary death. Sib came halfway and would not come further, and lay down in the snow at the last peg with her ears flat, and rumbled at me continuously in the low register that means the pack disapproves, which is a thing wolves have said to kings since kings existed. It took us 4 hours. She climbed like a woman going upstairs. Twice she put a hand back for me without looking, and I took it, and neither of us said anything about it. At the top the sky was enormous, and the stars were the size of gravel, and the whole valley lay below us under its blue lid. My hold a scatter of turf humps with smoke going up out of them in thin straight lines, because there is never any wind. She walked out onto the weight, and I followed with my heart in my mouth, and she stopped where the ice went bone-white and glassy. The throat, she called it, where the field bends over the lip of the rock and starts to hang. "Shout," she said. I could not. "My lord," she said, patient as a woman with a horse, "shout. I want to describe what it costs. Every man in Stillmark has a hand at his own throat from the age of 2. My father cuffed me once for laughing at a dog. I stood on the throat of the weight in the dark beside a dead woman, and I opened my mouth, and I could not make a sound come out of it, and I stood there heaving like a bellows, and she waited. She did not mock me. She waited perhaps 4 full minutes. And then she cupped her hands and threw her head back and screamed. She screamed the way you scream falling. It went out over the valley and came back off the far cliff a heartbeat later, thin and small, and went out again, and the stars did not move, and the ice under my boots was as dead as a table, and Marin lowered her hands and stood there with her breath smoking and said, quietly, "There. Now your father's funeral." She drove the pole in. It is 9 feet of ash with an iron ferrule and an iron collar, and she seated it a foot into the throat of the ice, and she said, "Give me the hammer," and I gave it to her, and she said, "Put your hands on the shaft. Both. Close your eyes. You'll want them closed." I put my hands on the pole, and she struck the collar, not hard, a wrist blow, the way you would tap a nail to start it, and the tone that came off that iron was deep and dull and short. It was not loud. A man 20 feet away would have heard a click. The weight answered. I felt it come up the ash into my palms and through my forearms and into my chest, a long shuddering HNNNN like something enormous turning over in its sleep. And it went on, and it went out and away from us under the whole field, and 1/2 mile to the west, a shelf of ice, the size of a barn, broke off the calving edge and went down into the gorge, and it was 4 seconds before we heard it land. I was on my knees. I did not remember kneeling. "Again," she said, "do it yourself. I'll hold the pole. You need to have done it." I struck it, and the mountain groaned under me, and I understood with my hands, in my bones, in a way no argument would ever have reached, that my father's funeral bell had rung for 11 minutes on a bright still morning 9 years ago, and that the weight had come down 4 hours later with a woman's name in its mouth that had never belonged there. "Low and struck," Marin said above me. "That's all it's ever wanted. Voices are nothing. Voices are birds. It's the grieve. It's always been the grieve. It fell for your grandfather's coronation and they blamed a boy with a whistle. It fell for the crowning before that. It fell the day of your father's burial, and it will fall the day of yours." And my mother stood on the west terrace with her lungs and her love, and she was the only person in the whole hold making a sound the mountain could not hear. I said into my hands on my knees, in front of a woman my kingdom had murdered, "How long have you known?" 6 years. "You told them." "I told the warden the first year. He wrote it down." She said it without heat. "That is the part I cannot get past. My lord, a dead woman can't testify." I did not sleep. I sat in the dark in my father's chair with the ringing screaming in my skull, and I did the arithmetic that no one in Stillmark had done for a century. 3 generations of the hush, 19 sounders buried alive on paper, a laundress on the ice road with her hands untied, 1,000 people who whisper to their children, and a man of 50 with beautiful handwriting who finds them when they don't. 43 dead on the West Terrace, and every one of them killed. I could not stop the word once I had it, killed by a right, rung by a bellright, ordered by a king. And in 11 days, at midwinter, at the hour of the nomming of my heir, the grieve was going to be rung again by my own decree in front of my whole hold, with my brother's son standing on the west gallery in a white coat, because it was fitting, because it was traditional, because I had sealed it in the spring when I was a man who had never touched a sounding pole. You will say, unmake the decree. You are a king. Say a word. Say it then. Say the word. Stand up in the great hall in front of the warden of the hush and the bellright whose family has kept the grieve for 6 generations, and the mothers of the West Terrace, and say, "My father's funeral killed your children, and my grandfather's crown killed your grandmothers, and every one of you has whispered your whole life for nothing, and the woman we put out on the ice road was innocent, and I have known this for 4 days, and I learned it from a corpse." I opened my mouth in the hall on the 5th morning, and what came out was, "The bell will be rung as decreed." I am not going to soften it. I had a proof I could not carry down the mountain. I had a witness who was legally dead. I had a warden with a petition to make her alive for 1 hour so we could hang her. And I was afraid. This is the true reason, and it took me years to say it plainly. I was afraid that if I said the hush was a lie, the hold would not simply be angry, it would be unmade. Every silence anybody had ever kept, every laugh swallowed, every child hushed, every funeral held early, all of it for nothing. I did not think we could survive knowing it. So I chose to let the bell be rung and to move the people. That was my plan, God help me, a king's compromise. I ordered the West Terrace closed for repair. I told my steward to have the wolves walk the evacuation line as an exercise. I sent grain up to the high pasture. I did everything a clever coward does, and I told nobody why, and I did not stop the bell. And Marin, who had every reason on this earth to let me, came into my hall on the 8th day past the guards, because nobody stops a dead woman, and she stood in front of my chair and she said out loud, in front of 9 counselors, in a voice that fell into that room like a dropped plate, "It won't be enough. Wake up." Greel had her taken, I let him, twice now twice. But she got the rest of it out while they were walking her to the door, and she said it in Stillmark sign with her hands bound at the wrist, which cannot be done, and which she did anyway, badly, cramped, one letter at a time, over her shoulder at me. THETHROAT, ISROTTNITWLCALVWSDAND, NORTHTHESOUNDRSROADISTHONLYWAYUPANDOUT. Ilson was on the stair. He saw the whole of it. He watched them take her out through the kitchen door, which is where they feed the dead, and then he came down into the hall and stood in front of me, 5 years old, in his white coat for the ceremony, and he lifted his hands and he signed, very slowly, the way you sign to a foreigner. "Uncle, she is not dead, she is right there." Then he sat down on the floor of my hall with his back to me, and would not turn around for the rest of the day. Midwinter in Stillmark is the one day of the year the whole hold comes above the roofline. 900 people on the terraces in the blue noon, dressed, packed, breathing. The Grieve in its stone housing on the West Terrace with its bronze scoured, the bellwright Tid beside it, 60 years old, whose father hung that bell and whose son held the rope. The warden at my left with his ledger. Ilson at my right in his white coat with his hair wet combed. I looked up at the weight, and it looked, as it has always looked, like a lid. I will not pretend I made a decision. I stood there. The hour came. The rite runs. The king names the heir walks the gallery, the bell is rung. I named him. I put my hand on his head and I said his name aloud, the one moment of speech our law allows a king, once in a reign, and my voice was so weak and unused that the front rank did not hear it. And Ilson walked the gallery, and Tid bowed to me, and I did not lift my hand. I did not lift my hand. Every night since, in the moment before sleep, I lift it. Tid's son pulled the rope, and the Grieve swung, and Stillmark heard its bell for the first time in 9 years. I have heard people describe it as beautiful. It is. It is a fat, low, gorgeous bronze sound, and it goes into your sternum and sits there, and 900 people made a noise that day that I have never heard from my people before or since. They exhaled, all of them, together, a sound like a wave going out. And on the 3rd stroke the weight answered. It did not crack. Everyone expects a crack. It went HNNNN, exactly as it had under my hands, and every soul on that terrace felt it come up through the stone into their feet, and the pigeons went off the roofs, and a hairline seam ran across the throat of the ice field a mile long in perfect silence. Then 900 people, in a hold where nobody has raised their voice in 3 generations, discovered that they did not know how to scream. That is the thing nobody tells you about a silent country. We had no word for run. We had no shout for this way. We had trained every mouth shut for 100 years, and we stood there in the blue light with our throats full of nothing while the ice came, and we could not tell each other where to go. Some ran down into the hold, into the roofed lanes, the drawers of the chest, the worst place in the world. Some ran east, toward the granary, which is where the north lobe went. My steward stood exactly where he was and put his hands over his mouth. Tid was still holding the rope. And the wolves knew. Hor was already up on the parapet with his head down and his chest going, rumbling the evacuation line. The line I had ordered walked as an exercise. The line Marin had told me to walk. 3 long and 1 short and 3 long, over and over. And it went out under the snow into every lane and every hall in Stillmark, and nobody understood it. because we had walked it once, as an exercise, 4 days ago, and a rumble in the floor is not a thing that turns a running crowd. The wolves knew the way, and could not say it in any tongue we had left ourselves. And my nephew, 5 years old, in a white coat on the west gallery, 20 feet above 900 people, who had never made a sound in his life, who had been shouted at by no one, hushed by everyone, and taught his letters by a woman who sang on a mountain because there was nobody up there to stop her. My nephew Ilson filled his lungs and screamed one word. Merin. It was a terrible sound. Cracked, high, unformed, a boy's first use of a thing he had carried 5 years and never once opened. It went across the terrace and off the cliff and came back. It was, I am fairly sure, the loudest noise made by a human being in Stillmark since my grandfather's day. And 900 faces came up. And he pointed, both arms the way you sign there but with the whole of him, east, along the parapet, past the granary, to the cut stair and the broken line of iron pegs and the road nobody walks. And Marin came up out of the crowd at the kitchen door where the dead are fed, and she stood at the foot of the Sounders Road with her pole across her body like a bar, and she opened her mouth, and she did what she had been doing for 7 years alone on top of a mountain. She sang, loudly, badly, one flat note held and then another, a marker, a beacon, a rope of sound in a country that had forgotten what sound was for. I have been asked whether it was a hymn. It was not. It was a counting song from the kitchens about a duck. They went to her, not in order and not calmly, but they went because there was a voice, and every animal on this earth goes toward a voice, and we are animals, and we had only ever been told otherwise. Hor and Sib worked the flanks. Tid carried 2 children up the stair on his back, one under each arm like faggots at 60 years old. The steward went last with an old woman on his hip. Greel stood in the middle of the west terrace with his ledger satchel, and did not move at all until Marin came back down through the crowd, down, against all of it, back into the falling, and took him by the sleeve and pulled him along like a boy. The north lobe came off. It took the granary and the mews and the whole of the east lane, and it stopped, God knows why, 40 feet from the mouth of the Sounders Road, and it stood there afterward for a year, a wall of dirty ice with a hen house sticking out of it. 900 people went up the Sounders Road that afternoon. It had been built for one dead woman at a time. We lost 4. The Bellwright's son, who let go of the rope and went back for the rope. An old man in the low lanes who could not be woken. 2 more I will name at every midwinter I have left. 4 out of 900, and it should have been 43 again. And every one of the 896 of us was standing on the ice above the hold that night because a child who had never spoken had spent 2 months following a woman around the kitchen door and learning that a mouth is for something. And Ilson would not stop. That is the part I did not expect, and it is the part I love best. He had opened the door and he could not shut it. He talked all night on the mountain, hoarse, wrong, half his words the shapes of signs and half of them the sounds of them, sitting inside Marin's coat with his head under her chin. He talked to the wolves and to the stars and to me, and to a woman he called Marin, 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 as if he were paying off a debt of 5 years in one night, and the whole hold sat around us in the dark on top of the very thing they had feared their entire lives, and listened to a boy shout, and nothing fell. That was the proof, not the pole, not my hands, not any argument I could have made in any hall. 896 people sat all night on the roof of the world with the ice under them, and a child made noise, and the mountain did not care. I have to tell the rest quickly, because it is not the good part, and you have come this far for the good part. We wintered in the high pasture and the sheep sheds, and half of us in the snow, and it was hard, and 11 more died of it, and nobody blamed the boy, though I was ready to break the arm of the first person who did. Bellwright Tid, who had buried his son under the granary, went down alone in the spring with a hammer and broke the greave where it lay, and brought it up in pieces on a sledge, and asked me for the forge. He recast it himself over 4 months. He did not make a crown of it, and he did not make a ring of it. And when I offered him the king's iron to mix in, he told me, a bellwright, to his king, out loud in a voice like a raven, because we had all begun to talk by then and none of us were any good at it, that I could keep my iron. He cast the metal of the greave into 91 sounding poles. Every one of them is 9 feet, ash-shafted, with a green bronze collar and a green bronze ferrule, and they are the only bronze in Stillmark, and there is one in every household, and children are taught with them. And once a season anybody who wants to may go up the Sounders Road and lean out over the throat and learn what the mountain is actually made of. 900 people whispered for 100 years because they had never touched the thing. That was the entire trick of it. Fear is only ever an unvisited place. Warden Otho Greel came to me in the spring with his petition, the 9-line one in the beautiful hand, and asked leave to burn it, and then asked to be made a sounder. I said no. He asked again in the summer and again the next year, and the answer is still no and will be no while I live. I will not bury another human being to feel safe. What I did instead was worse for him and better for everybody. I left him in his office, and I made the hush an hour long. That was Marin's condition, not mine. She said the hold would tear itself apart with noise if we simply threw the law away, and she was right. For 2 years Stillmark was the loudest place in the north, and men who had whispered for 50 years found they could not stop shouting, and there were fights over nothing, and children were terrified of their own fathers' voices. So there is an hour before dawn still every day in which nobody speaks. Not for the ice, for us. To hear what is under it. Greel keeps it. He walks the lanes with no lantern and no ledger, and he is very, very good at it. And the children are not afraid of him. And I do not know what else to do with a man like that, except let him be useful in the only shape he has. The 19 dead Sounders were restored to the rolls on the 1st of Thaw. 14 were already dead in the ordinary way and got their names back on stone. 5 walked into the hall on their own feet and sat down at tables they had been mourned away from, and one of them, a woman of 70, put her hands flat on the wood and cried without a sound, because she did not know how to do it any other way, and her granddaughter, who was 40, and had never once been allowed to speak to her, knelt down and howled for her. We opened Annette's case. There was no case. There was a page and a name and the arithmetic of a frightened afternoon. I had the page read aloud in the hall, and then I said what needed saying, and it took me a long time to get through it, and I got no credit for it and asked for none. Her name is cut into the stone of the West Terrace at the height of a laundress's eye. It was the last stone the ice ever touched. And I did not make Marin a queen. I want to be careful here, because I have heard how it is told in the low country, and they have me putting a cloak around her on the terrace with the whole hold bowing, and it is a lovely story and it is a lie, and it would have been the 5th wrong thing I did to that woman. She was not cast out and raised up. She was killed and unkilled. There is no ceremony for that, so I made one out of the only material I had, which was my own hands and a spade. I went out on the night of the 1st of Thaw to the Sounders' ground, which is a bad piece of land behind the mews where the hold buries its living, and I found the marker with her name on it, a slate, hand-cut, laid down when she was 19, and I got down on my knees in the mud in my good coat and I dug it out. It took 4 hours. It was under 9 years of frost. I broke 2 fingernails to the quick, and I did not use a torch because I did not want to be seen, and I did not want to be seen because I was not doing it for the hold. I have done a great many things for the hold. This was the first thing I ever did against it. She found me at about the 3rd hour because Hoare told her, because of course he did. She stood at the edge of the ground with her pole and watched a king dig up her grave, and she did not help me, which was correct, and she did not stop me, which was mercy. When it was out, I stood up with it and my arms were shaking, and I could not think of a single word. She said, "Say it then." And I found I had no idea how. I have told you that I have never in my life spoken above a whisper. I was 34 years old, and I had never said anything true to anyone at a volume they could hear. So I put the slate down and I asked her in sign, because that is my mother tongue and it is hers, and because there was nothing about her I wanted to shout. I signed the old form, the one the kitchen's use, that means stand at my table, and my hands were filthy and shaking and I made a mess of the second word, and had to do it twice. And Marin looked at me for what I can only describe as an insultingly long time. Then she did not sign and she did not speak. She took my two hands, the broken nails, the mud, and she put them on the shaft of her sounding pole both, the way she had on the throat of the weight, and she folded her own around them, and she held on. That is the sign the sounders make to each other when they lean out over the calving edge, and it does not mean yes, and it does not mean love. It means the ice holds. The ringing in my ears has never come back. Physicians say it was in the ear and would have gone in its own time. My wife says it was in the ear and would not have. Ilson, who is 14 now and never shuts up, says it was in my head where the guilt was, and then he laughs like a door coming off its hinges, and I do not correct him, because he is the only person in my kingdom who is allowed to say anything he likes to me and knows it. He shifted at 11, the first in Stillmark in 90 years. It sounded like a green branch breaking. Half the hold came out into the lane to see what had died. Now in thaw, when the throat is soft and the reading has to be done, the two of us walk up the Sounders Road with Marin ahead of us and Sib's grandchildren strung out along the pegs, and my wife leans out over 300 feet of nothing with a pole in her hands, while I hold the belt at her back, which is a dead man's job, and which I have never once let anyone else do. And when she has taken her reading, my nephew stands up on the shelf above the throat where the ice is bone-white and glassy, and fills his lungs, and shouts something appalling at the top of his voice. His own name, usually, or a rude word about the warden, out across the valley and the roofs and the thin straight lines of smoke, at the mountain that has eaten this family twice. And the mountain, which is not a god and never was, says nothing back. It never had.